Hi, everybody. I want to tell you a little story about historical interpretation, the way it goes down. This is a personal experience. I thought I was going to write it up as a blog post, but as I think you'll see, it's maybe a little too sensitive for that. And it's relevant to this week's topic. So here we go. For 12 years, my wife and I lived in Carthage, Missouri. It's the very buckle of the Bible Belt, a really conservative area. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's important background to this. We had one national park monument close to us, and it was the birthplace of George Washington Carver. If you've never heard of George Washington Carver, you should look him up. He is really a great American. He was born right at the end of the Civil War. It's often said he was born a slave. That's probably not quite true. But he's this black child growing up in southwest Missouri. His father was very likely his owner. His is listed as sort of unidentified in his life. Anyway, he grows up in rural Missouri. He has to walk a great distance to go to a school. The nearest schools were whites only, but there was what they call the Lincoln School over in Neosho, so he'd walk from his farmstead to there every day to get an education. Super smart, ends up going to some college and becomes a great scientist. He was an agronomist. He's most famous for inventing peanut butter and other substances that could be made out of peanuts. The attempt was to help his people, other freed African Americans after the Civil War. Anyway, through some quirk of fate in the 1960s, as the National Park Service is kind of responding to some of the concerns in American society in the 1960s, it's looking to create more sites for African Americans in the national park system. And his birthplace, here in very rural Missouri, was made a national monument. It's not very large. It's, I don't know, 10 or 100 acres, somewhere in there. Some charming farmland, a few trails. We'd go there a lot because there weren't really a lot of other places to go to get our outdoor fix in that part of Missouri. Anyway, I worked at Missouri Southern State University in those days, and I would occasionally send interns to the national park site. One of them got hired on permanently. She's there to this day. I was active in local history. So when they decided to do a new interpretive center at the site, I was invited to be on the planning committee. Now, the way this worked was a scholar from, I won't name him mostly because I can't remember his name, but I wouldn't name him anyway. A scholar from the University of Illinois, a sociologist who made his living this way, would fly out and do a workshop with the experts that were assembled, and they talk to the experts and say, okay, what should we emphasize in the new visitor center? And there were three teams. One was the natural environment, the other was I forget what, and the third one was history, and I was on the history team. The interpretation of George Washington Carver up until that point had been as conservative and as safe and as careful as you can imagine. The emphasis was entirely on Carver as a scientist and a Christian. Which is interesting, but there was like a spiritual walk you could do with Bible passages that were supposedly some of Carver's favorite Bible passages. It's an interpretation very much shaped by the environment around it. And what we learned from there is that Carver was born into slavery. He found a peanut, he found Jesus, and he lived happily ever after, though not there. The real story of Carver and Southwest Missouri is much darker than that. After the Civil War, many African Americans were looking to flee the Deep South, and Southwest Missouri seemed like a good place for some of them to go. So you get an increasing population of blacks, though they'd only been 5 or maybe 10% of the population before the war. You see a lot more afterwards. Missouri, by the way, was a slave state, but a marginal slave state. Most people in Missouri went for the Union during the Civil War. So anyway, you get blacks coming into the area in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, and eventually it causes quite a lot of tensions. And the white population pushes back, and with a lot of extra-legal violence, lynching, race riots, things like that, the blacks are pushed back out of Southwest Missouri. It's really an example of ethnic cleansing, is what it is. So whereas in the 1880s you see a pretty substantial population of blacks in almost every little town in the Ozarks, by 1920 they are gone. There are a few towns where blacks were still allowed to live, a few of the larger cities. The other towns became sundown towns. What that means is blacks were allowed to come in during the day to spend their money, but they needed to be gone at night, and there was the threat of lynching and actual lynchings, any number of places that keep them out. George Washington Carver witnessed one of these lynchings in a little town over the border in Kansas, and that's what finally caused him to leave the area. So anyway, we all get together, we're in this group, and the history group is me and some local historians who very much like the Jesus in a Peanut interpretation of George Washington Carver, who very much didn't like talking about anything bad that had happened in the area. History should be positive. History should build people up. It should make them feel good, was their attitude. And me. So we open up discussion. What should the new interpretation be? And I said, well, we need to talk about the legacy of racial violence in this area. We need to talk about the lynchings. We need to talk about it all within the big picture of Reconstruction. And we need to, specifically call it out as ethnic cleansing, what happened here. Well, that didn't go over well. That didn't go over well at all with the other panelists. And we got in a big fight. And one of the local historians, her name, never mind her name, but she's kind of the queen bee of local history. She had her little book about the history of Neosho, Missouri, and so on. She was so angry at me. She said, well, would George Washington Carver even have known what Reconstruction was? I said, well, yeah, I think a black man living in Reconstruction might have known what Reconstruction was. And so we go back and forth, and they push back. But I took my PhD and I smacked them over the head with it, good and hard, until they relented. And I finally got the group to agree that this is what we needed to do, and they very grudgingly wrote it down. So then the interpretation, then we reconvene the three groups to reveal our findings to the whole group. And this local historian, who was our recording secretary for our group, she kind of bit it out. She has her piece of paper there, and she goes, we think we need to talk more about racial violence and Reconstruction. She just bit it out. It was a painful moment of her life. So she said all this, and the PhD, when I was in sociology, which is not a real discipline. I didn't say that. So she reports that, and the PhD who's convening the whole thing goes, well, would Carver even have known what Reconstruction was? And the local historian goes, that's what I said. He made me do it, and, pointing at me. So I had the same fight again with the whole big group and got them to agree that that's what should happen. So I go home. I felt pretty good about it. A couple weeks later, I get a letter in the mail from the superintendent of the national park, or the national monument, who was herself a very conservative Christian, was very down with the old interpretation. And she said, Dear Professor Sabula, thank you so much for serving on our committee. Your input was so valuable, and because of your unique perspective and input, we have agreed, moving forward, that at the new Interpretive Center, we will have renewed and deeper emphasis of George Washington Carver's Christianity. Thank you so much. So I cussed for a while and I drank a little bit and said, oh well, I'll never try and help the Park Service again. I am done with them. About 2 years later, the new Interpretive Center was open, and I was not eager to go there. But I had a friend from out of town, and we had a day to kill. And again, there's not a lot to do in Southwest Missouri, so I said, let's go check this out. And as we drove to the Interpretive Center, I told him the whole story and laughed, and I said, okay, let's steel ourselves, let's go in. So we walk inside, and one of the very first interpretive panels talks about George Washington Carver, and it says, Carver was forced to leave this area in an era of racial violence that took place in the 1880s and 1890s, including lynchings that drove out the black population from the area. You could have knocked me over with a feather. To this day, I'm not entirely sure how this came about. It might be the local committee sent a recommendation to emphasize Carver's Christianity more, and it got to Harper's Ferry, the headquarters for the Park Service, and somebody said, no, let's not do that. I'm not sure how it happened, but the interpretation is dead on, and it's accurate, and it's excellent. So that's my story about consulting with the National Park Service. Like I said, I thought about typing it up as a blog post. That didn't seem quite appropriate, but I wanted it to be a part of this class. So there you go.